Earlier we learned the definition of a coterminal angle. Two angles are coterminal if their initial and terminal sides are the same. In the diagram below, we can see that we have an angle at pi over 6, and we have another angle at 13 pi over 6. But both angles end at the same terminal side. Pi over 6 ends here, and 13 pi over 6 makes a full revolution around, plus a little bit more, and ends at pi over 6. Mathematically, we can figure this out by subtracting 2 pi from 13 pi over 6. Because 13 pi over 6 is greater than 1 revolution, we're going to subtract 1 revolution. Ideally, when we're working with finding coterminal angles, we generally like to find angles that are between 0 and 2 pi, positive, or if we're working with degrees, we'd like to find angles that are between 0 degrees and 360 degrees that are positive. So looking at what your end goal is, you can figure out whether you should add or subtract revolutions. And remember, in working with radians, 1 revolution equals 2 pi. So if you have an angle theta, you can add or subtract 2 pi times the number of revolutions. So in the example below, we have 13 pi over 6 minus 2 pi. Rewriting those with a common denominator of 6, we have 13 pi over 6 minus 12 pi over 6 equals pi over 6. Therefore, 13 pi over 6 and pi over 6 are equivalent. We can see that in the diagram below. Equivalently, we can do the same thing in degrees. Because 13 pi over 6 equals 390 degrees, and we want to get to an angle between 0 and 360 degrees, we're going to subtract 1 revolution, or 360 degrees, which is simply 30 degrees. And looking at our diagram to the right, we see we have pi over 6, which is equal to 30 degrees. So therefore, 30 degrees and 390 degrees are coterminal angles or equivalent angles. Let's look at another problem. This time we have an angle theta that equals negative 2 pi over 3. So we're going to go clockwise, negative 2 pi over 3 units, or radians in this case. So negative 2 pi over 3 ends in quadrant 3, or equivalently, we can see from the diagram, we could go counterclockwise, a positive 4 pi over 3 units, and end up at the same terminal side. Let's look at this mathematically. Off to the left, we see that we have negative 2 pi over 3. Because we want to get to a positive angle between 0 and 2 pi, we're going to add 1 revolution of 2 pi. So we're going to add 2 pi. We can rewrite this with a common denominator of 3. So negative 2 pi over 3 plus 2 pi equals negative 2 pi over 3 plus 6 pi over 3, which is simply 4 pi over 3, which we can see is correct according to the diagram on the right. Equivalently, looking at it in terms of degrees, since negative 2 pi over 3 equals negative 120 degrees, and we want to get to a positive angle in degrees, we're going to add 1 revolution of 360 degrees. So negative 120 plus 360 equals 240 degrees. Again, we can verify that by looking at the diagram to the right. All right, now go ahead and try one on your own. This time, I would like you to find a negative coterminal angle. So we have an angle, theta, which is 3 pi over 4 in radians, or equivalently 135 degrees in degrees. So I would like you to find a negative angle that's equivalent to 3 pi over 4 in radians, and a negative angle that's equivalent to 135 degrees in degrees. Let's see how you did. Because we're starting with 3 pi over 4, which is a positive angle, and we want to end up with a negative angle, we're going to subtract 1 revolution. We're going to subtract 2 pi. So rewriting this with a common denominator, we have 3 pi over 4 minus 2 pi has a denominator of 1, so our common denominator is 4. So we have 8 pi over 4, which equals 3 pi minus 8 pi is a negative 5 pi over 4. So 3 pi over 4 and negative 5 pi over 4 are coterminal or equivalent angles. Let's look at this in degrees now. Because we were told that 3 pi over 4 equals 135 degrees, which you should also be able to figure out, and we know that we want to get to a negative angle, we're going to subtract 1 revolution. In terms of degrees, that's 360 degrees. And 135 degrees minus 360 degrees equals a negative 225 degrees. Let's look at this graphically now. Okay, so we're started with an angle of positive 3 pi over 4, going counterclockwise. The equivalent coterminal angle from a negative angle is negative 5 pi over 4, traveling clockwise. So we know 3 pi over 4 and negative 5 pi over 4 are equivalent angles. Similarly, if we convert those to degrees, 3 pi over 4, or 135 degrees, is equal to negative 5 pi over 4, or negative 225 degrees.